Hi, and welcome to a new episode of the Blue Quist Human Potentials podcast. My name is Johannes. I'm founder and CEO of Blue Quist, a modern talent management SaaS company. And we do these podcasts with thought leaders from industry, or let's also say very, very interested people into how the industry is changing in terms of HR, talent management. And also right now with artificial intelligence, or let's say LLMs, entering the space and really doing lots of work. So this is kind of the scene and sphere of this podcast. And today I'm happy to welcome Andrew Collier from Campari in our round here. And we will have the next 30 or 45 minutes a conversation about, well, on the one side, HR, learning development in global organizations and the industry itself, certain industry branches, but also especially about what artificial intelligence and LLM is changing in that domain right now with hands-on experience, and also especially with a look on the future. What does it mean for skills, for the development of skills, for learning development, talent management in general? What can we expect of this? I think, Andrew, we both see ourselves as humble learners, so we still are exploring the scene and try to figure out what's happening in our both personal and professional lives. So I'm really happy, also looking back at our almost 3 years of experience now together, at our collaboration, and also looking forward in that. And I'm happy to welcome you here. So maybe let's start by a short intro from yourself. So our listeners get to know you a bit more, and then we dive right into the conversation, okay?
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks, Johannes. It's nice to be here, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation because, as you say, we're learning, and it's such an interesting topic. So I look after Campari University. We're a distributed learning platform, actually. That's relatively new for our organization. And we're learning a lot. And right now we're really grappling with the challenges that AI is throwing up. We can really see how it's changing the landscape. And it's just great to start to try and dig a little bit deeper and understand a little bit more about how AI affects our world.
Our world and our humans in this world, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I find that extremely interesting also. Looking at how transformer models are right now expanding their kind of capacities, but also on the side of AI-generated content. Like if you look at the latest generations of these imaging softwares, it's crazy how really this is resembling actual work of professionals. So it's moving fast. So let's see if we can find a little bit of sense making in that topic.
Yeah.
So. Maybe to start this, bit of framing. Over the last decades, talent management was built around roles, job descriptions, mostly static competency frameworks that are fixed and set into stone. Some organizations have really good competency frameworks, some have less developed, many are on a journey. And now, suddenly we're entering a phase where AI and, let's say, machine learning, LLM, AI, so automated systems for reasoning and generation of content and intelligent content are entering a phase where this can analyze skills, feedback, performance, patterns, and development paths at a completely different scale and also return of investment ratio. So we talked about this. The interesting question becomes if let's for the sake of simplification always say AI, okay? Can detect patterns and generate insights. What's the role of humans? And to lead over to the first conversation question, and you and I talked about this concept of humans moving into a ratification role when it comes to AI-generated insights, content, and talent management. I found that extremely interesting as a first starting point to discuss what is the role that we will as humans and professionals in organizations have in the future most likely, when we see how much of potential work and productivity these systems can take over. How does that implicate people in organizations working currently in the future? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I think a large part of our role is what I'm sort of conceptualizing as collaborative, right? Obviously, there's now three domains where collaboration will be important. So human to human, of course, and that's where we would expect it. Obviously, we have a place to play, but then there's the human to AI and the augmented side, and we have to learn how to collaborate with that very new entity.
Yeah.
So, human collaboration is not easy. We're not perfect at it. We need to develop a lot. And I think AI accelerates that. And on top of that, we need to learn how to collaborate with a completely new, alien intelligence or artificial intelligence. So that's a challenge. And then, of course, there's even the AI to AI, which we need to be aware of and understand, because that's also going to be a domain of relationship that is completely unfamiliar to us. We have a little bit of it with some of the digitalization and automation that we've already experienced, but I think AI brings it to a new level. So for me, it's helpful to think about it as how do we collaborate, and what skills do we need to collaborate in those three different domains. That's one starting point that I've been reflecting on.
Okay. That's so, and as I assume, this kind of classification will have a lot of implication on where the systems will take over work, where they will work in conjunction with humans, and where humans will retain their role. Right?
Yeah.
I think it was from Gartner, one of those squadrons where they categorize this into like, we have to define spaces in organizations where we want to retain the work as people and humans, where we work together with systems, and where we let systems handle the actual work in the future. So in order to make that distinction, where we invest heavily into like upskilling of people, or where we invest heavily into upscaling of systems, because this will, and this is kind of my question to you. Where do you see, and I think you have a lot of experience in the past 20 years, seeing how your organizations where you worked evolved. Like right now, where do you see AI entering your domain, skill and talent management, in organizational settings right now in real time, concretely? What use cases do you already see?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with a story of something I experienced recently, because I think, intellectually we all understand AI is going to be disruptive. And as you said, as AI's capabilities accelerating, we have to constantly reset what we think the impact is going to be. But, recently, one of my colleagues who's been working heavily in AI really brought this home to me, because he had been working on a project to define capabilities and a capability building strategy for our organization. He did this 10 times, 100 times faster than I could ever do it, came up with an output that was as good, if not better, than something I could have done. And he didn't need to invite me, involve me, collaborate with me whatsoever. So it was a big moment where I sort of realized, okay, this is how disruptive personally it's going to be. And it really got me to think about, okay, well, what does that mean for, our work in L&D? What does that mean for the skills that organizations actually mean? I don't think that the old way of thinking of skills management necessarily applies anymore, because AI can do a lot of it, So I was very much put in the frame of mind of, okay, well, if you don't need my knowledge, you don't need my expertise, because that can be easily codified. What do you need me for? I'm not sure I've got an answer to that question fully yet. But it was quite confronting.
So this was kind of a aha moment where you said, "Oh,
absolutely."
And what do you think, like in this instance, in regards to your colleague, what skills did he possess that enabled him to create this so fast? With, of course, the help probably of one of the large LLM models. Let's not promote any here. But what do you think was his determining skill to really make it that fast? Do you think it was major impact, or could it bluntly said, could it have been any white collar worker? So that would be like an interesting question.
Yeah, I'm not sure it could be anyone, right? I think one of the things that I'm really identifying and understanding is you need a level of process thinking. And a lot of people don't have that. We don't tend to think in process. And I think that's one of the things that has enabled, my colleague to deliver, in this case, something really good, because he was able to identify the steps involved with the desired output. And it's, in a way, it's this process thinking, I think, that allows, humans and AIs to communicate, to interact. It's sort of a common way of thinking that can allow this collaboration that we need to achieve. So, I think that's the first thing, and then I think it's very much then related to this is the critical reasoning and the sense making is, what sort of information is useful or relevant to provide as a knowledge source for an agent. Okay. So it's this very much critical. The AI can't do anything without that initial process thinking, sense making, critical reasoning. Otherwise, it's garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, true. Well, if we look at the hallucination of those systems, we always have, right now at least, get quite some garbage out, even if we put good stuff in. But that leads me to my next. Like, this is kind of getting to the juice of the topic right now. So what we observe, or what I observe also across organizations where we as company, as BlueQuist, but also I work in, is that these systems, AI systems, increase ability to recognize, analyze patterns, and therefore augment human capability areas massively. But here it comes now to the intellectual concept that we wanted to discuss. Like, historically, if you look at since the Industrial Revolution, or even before, humans created the insights and systems, and the systems they created helped to store the data that came out of those insights. So, 10 years ago, your colleague would have used probably 10 times the time, 100 times the time, probably, to sit down, create concepts, talk to people, talk to you, build conceptual drafts, outlines. And then it would have taken a few more weeks at least to come to that kind of concept you needed for Campari. So now AI can generate those, but still humans need to interpret and ratify them. So I'm questioning, why might human oversight become more important as AI becomes more capable? And also, what does this mean if you look at, it doesn't have to be Campari, it can be also your current and past work environments. What does that mean in terms of the skills that need to be fostered in those environments?
Well, there's a lot there. Maybe I'll start with the last point first. I think one of the realizations I'm having is that, we know the promise of skills management. We've never really been able to deliver on it. And AI gives us that possibility because of the scale, because of the speed. For the first time, I think it's realistic to identify and evaluate all the skills that exist in an organization. Whereas before, that was just tedious, hard work for very little return. So AI gives us this possibility, and that's very, very exciting. But I start, if it can identify and evaluate the skills of, say, an engineer or a salesperson or an L&D professional, I think what's shifting is previously we would have thought that information would help us then develop engineers, salespeople, HR people with those skills that they need. Yes. Now I'm starting to really understand that directly a lot of that skill and that thinking can be replaced, right? They can actually do it for us. So, as an organization, I start to think, well, why do I need to hire an L&D professional if I can codify all of the knowledge and experience and expertise that an L&D professional have? And then I can just work with that person. I don't need to work with another. I can work with that agent. I don't need to work with another person.
Yes.
Right. So I think that means then, of course, and this is what you're getting at, the type of skills that we would have thought of before, hard and soft, is really only the soft that are relevant for humans to have. I think
Yes.
all of the hard skills can just be replaced.
Okay, I love that. No, I love the idea of discussing that.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure we love the idea of the implications of that.
No,
And
but
that's the bit that I think is the
yeah,
second part
exactly.
of what you're talking about is I think in the initial stage of this sort of transformation, the oversight is required to manage the output, right? And to make sure that the results are there, that there is no hallucination or that we've got the right framework and structure in place to deliver what we want. But I think longer term, over time, the real important need will be oversight more from the ethical, moral
Yes,
um,
exactly.
perspective.
And also the implications for the labor force.
Exactly right. Like, do we really want to replace the human
Yes,
salesperson?
yes.
Yeah,
What is okay? Do we want that? That's a good question. I think that question comes down to the ethical baseline you have in your organization or in the group. So that is something that is deterministic by the head of this, let's say the head of the, or like the culture that
yeah,
you are navigating
yeah.
in. And I guess the culture plays then a decisive role for the implications or for
Yeah.
the
It's a very interesting question.
consequences.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, for the consequences. Yeah.
It's a really interesting question for a company like Campari because our business is social, right?
Yes.
One of our values is togetherness, and what our kind of purpose is to bring people together so they can connect. Connect over a drink, connect over a social moment. So it's core to our reason for being. So that's a very interesting decision that an organization like ours needs to make. Because AI can threaten the type of connections, the type of relationships. It could potentially degrade those relationships, or it could allow more time for deeper, stronger human relationships because it's covering off other stuff that maybe distracted us in the past or that maybe, diverted our attentions and energies onto
Yes.
other stuff that's really less important at the end of the day. So it's a really interesting kind of dilemma, if you like, because you can see the attractiveness from a productivity perspective, right? Like AI can free up a lot of investment, a lot of cost.
It can, yes. And it does today already, right? It doesn't, I mean, Campari is a fundamentally different business model than, let's say, high frequency trading at the
Yeah,
global stock markets, where systems talk to systems about miniature variables.
yeah,
And the trading does already since 10 years happen fully automatic. And in Campari, you are trying to sell a feeling, right? You're trying to sell a moment, a experience. And the question is, how much can you automate? But even then, like, first of all, you said ethical oversight. Even if we can streamline production by 30% with artificial intelligence, what happens then? We don't need to talk about this, but any organization right now
yeah,
is automatically under the pressure of this development because there are forces in the market that always in our capitalistic structure at the moment
that's right.
move towards optimization. And if a new means of optimization is coming into play, it needs to be exploited. That's how I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying that's how the markets like structurally operate. And in another podcast, we could also talk about if we need a new model for that, because then the outcome will be different. But the question will be how also Campari is handling that kind of structural pressure that's coming. Because if competitors are using that kind of advantage, then it becomes very hard to not do the same things that maybe culturally differently aligned
Yeah,
competitors are doing that, right? What do you think about
yeah.
it?
No, I think that's exactly the challenge. I think that because of competition, because of the structural dynamics of capitalism, we are kind of being forced marched into a new way of working, of managing society, without any possibility. Even we've got the awareness, but no real kind of incentive to just give us pause, So I think that it's a very, very interesting bind that we find ourselves in. I think we're going to walk towards outcomes that we don't necessarily want to have, because just the incentives are misaligned, or the competitive pressures are, misaligned. So, yeah, don't know how. It's probably a subject for another podcast, because I also see that AI itself, it's continuing this journey that we started on with digitalization and with the internet, and how the internet has enabled the democratization of a lot of stuff. I don't necessarily need to pay for a printer now if I want to publish a book. I can do it myself. I think AI brings that to the next level, right? And really challenges, why do I need to pay for anything anymore? Potentially.
Yes.
So that, I think, really challenges capitalism, how to get return on capital. And you can see it with AI companies struggling with how to monetize this. We've really only got two options, which is advertising and subscription as kind of business models. But AI could even really threaten that. So I think that's a fascinating sort of long-term concept to explore further. I'm probably not qualified even to explore that topic, but yeah, it's such an interesting dimension.
Yeah, but it's a fundamental question that probably that would be great if more people generally would take care and in terms of thinking about it, because it affects the regular lives of probably everybody living in modern society. So but let's go back a bit more circle back to the actual topic of making decisions and in the area of role, skill, talent management. When you think about in terms of the question of legitimacy of decisions. So how do you legitimize decisions in the future, and also if a lot of the content comes out of the system? Do we want to keep that in the human hand, or do we? Because if you instruct one of those agent systems to be your partner for learning and development, where does the actual decision making lie? So is it still in the hands of do we need us for that, or do we even give the hand that over? What's your?
It's such a good question, Johannes. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. My initial reaction is, there's three stages where the decisions can be made. At the start, in the design of the AI relationship, during and managing how those decisions are kind of reviewed, and then the implementation right at the end, and choosing what to execute. Right, and I think the right answer is we need to be, as humans, managing all of those stages. My fear is that we'll shortcut it. We'll see that actually the middle bit we don't even need. Let's not bother reviewing. It's a little bit too much effort. It slows things down. It's good enough. So I can see there's a real human inclination to kind of skip over some of this stuff. But probably the right thing to do is to be very, very conscious of the responsibility to manage decision making all the way through in those three stages.
Exactly.
Yeah. What's your thinking on this?
Well, I think that's one of the top three. That's one of the top three concerns with the whole LLM and artificial intelligence discussion is who has the agency, right? Who has the agency about what's coming out of that and how this is being used? Because it's fundamentally a question, from my perspective, of intention.
Yeah.
Right? No, right now we don't have systems that have their own agency. We have self-optimization systems that optimize actually to the goal that has been given to them. Right? That's what they do. They optimize, transformer models optimize to outcomes that have been instructed into them, and these instructions come from humans. So it's like this. Right now we have the same discussion with a hammer can be used as a tool for good or as a tool for bad, right? So right now we are at that stage, and therefore I think, at least right now, and also probably for a relatively long future, from my perspective, the decision-making power should be in the hands, and the ethical, how do you call it, legitimization of what comes out of the how it's being used should be in the human's hand,
Yeah.
definitely,
Yeah.
because otherwise we have no control over what's happening, and also we cannot be assured that a system thinks in a way that is optimizing towards the organizational well-being or the human well-being, but it's optimizing towards something that, these systems can be optimizing towards anything. There's this interesting parable where you have this question. So if there's a artificial superintelligence in the future that is not conscious, but it's so intelligent that it optimizes towards a singular goal in the most efficient manner and integrates into all systems that we've built as humanity.
Yeah.
Now, if this system optimizes towards creating enough space for trees on the planet and the right conditions for a lot of trees, then the human is in the way, right? So it will optimize towards that goal, even if. So the question of ethical concern and discern becomes so crucial in that, and that we are tightly intertwined. So if you ask me, this still should lie within the hands of the human will also, until we cannot be 100% or super sure that there is an intelligent system that acts according to human well-being, right?
Look, AI really confronts us with paradox, right? And we're not very good with paradoxical thinking. I see a lot in the organizations that I interact with, just either or, right? Quite simplistic either or, black and white type of way of seeing the world. And, we need to get better at thinking, like holding two ideas that are opposing together at the same time in our heads. If I think of learning, right, learning with AI is a great paradox, right? Because it's a great tool to help us learn. We can literally have our own tutor, our own personal tutor and personal coach, personal teacher, everybody on the planet potentially, right? But using it, so, if used in the right way, it's a great learning tool. It's a great learning partner.
Yes.
But it can give us this. It can really attract us to shortcutting learning, skipping learning, letting it do all the work. We no longer now need to think, because in 2 seconds I can get somebody to write a report for me, and I don't have to worry about it. I can go and watch YouTube or play a game, right?
Yes.
So then I'm not really learning at all. And I think in general it's sort of this amazing opportunity for us to evolve our humanity to another level, really. But the flip side of that is that we can lose our humanity totally. So it really requires a lot of foresight, conviction. As you were talking, I was thinking about self-awareness, how important self-awareness is, because we need to be super clear on our intentions when we're using this.
Yes. And we have to still assume that human consciousness is something fundamentally embedded into our reality, and we don't understand it. So maybe we will never understand it, right? So let's value that until the point where we know better. So
and we are trying to understand AI through that very imperfect lens, right?
Yes, true.
We're putting a lot of human anthropomorphic. Are you there? Yeah, I think I just lost you a little bit. We're putting a lot of anthropomorphic qualities, on top of AI, giving it all of these traits to help us understand it better. Yes. But that could be completely the wrong perspective to be applying, completely invalid.
Yes.
And absolutely flawed, and therefore, we're kind of responding, reacting, designing our relationships with AI from a completely wrong starting point.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, that's like very metaphysical right now. Let's go back to a bit more concrete. Concrete. And we are working right now very intensively together on defining modern skill topologies
Yeah.
and dynamic skill management. So this is a concrete example where you are right now working on. Do traditional competency frameworks still work in this current moment where large part of your organization is starting to either explicitly or implicitly using those systems? How does this implicate the skill management that an organization like Campari or like needs to implement over the next 5 years? What do you think?
Yeah, well, look, I think it can work and can still be used the way we used to think about it. So, I think AI can really help us design and develop and define competencies very quickly, and then manage, the competency framework or the taxonomy that you're using within an organization, and use that structure to understand the skills that are available. But, I think that almost immediately, once you start using AI to that end, you realize that the static fixed structure is not necessary whatsoever, because AI, as you say, can identify patterns in behavior and knowledge bases. If we can codify, the methods and the processes behind a lot of the skills that we need in an organization,
Yeah.
you don't need to define it at all, really. AI can identify patterns at a given moment in time, and as those patterns change, it can take another reading and see, how things are evolving. You don't need any structured definition whatsoever, right? Because that is the nature of skills, right? They evolve and change. Some skills become obsolete. Some skills that interact with other skills in different ways. So what's the value of saying, I need these 10 skills and they're defined this way? It's limited, It's much better to sort of say, okay, I've had 20 people move in and out of my organization over the last 3 weeks. What's happened now with the skills that we have in our organization? How has that evolved? How
Yes.
would, how do we need to think about or define those skills based on what we actually see versus what we think we might see, and trying to overlay that
Yeah.
beforehand. So, this ability to, or the need to define skills, I think, is unnecessary, because AI has the has the ability to identify the patterns that exist and can define it for you in real time.
Yeah. How do you manage and mitigate the risk of oversimplification in that kind of line?
Yeah, well, it still always comes back to how you design the agent to do what you want it to do, right? I think that's the key bit. You need to have the right critical reasoning in place to think through the potential issues that can arise, and make sure that you're designing the agent with the right knowledge sources, with the right rules and guardrails, to make sure that it can deal with, the potential challenges that come up. So it very much in the initial design of the agents that you're working with, or the AI platforms that you're working with, I think that's where it's incumbent to sort of deal with the potential issues that arise. And that's a bit what worries me. I think you can too quickly run into just designing something. It'll give you something good enough that you can immediately start to work with, and you don't need to, in a way, stop and think, because
Yes.
you're very quickly, very easily getting something that you can work with that's maybe 10 times better than what you could do before. So this sort of, to me, it's very much about how you set up the initial design and framework for the AI that you're going to work with. That's
So
the
would
key
you?
bit.
Yeah. So paraphrasing the last 25 minutes. So we said that these systems will have an impact, a huge impact on our daily work, no matter if we conceptually oversee that or just let it happen organically. And there can be no real decision-making power in the hands of those systems at the moment. So we still definitely need human agency. We value the human traits and competencies in that, but we also recognize that those humans working in organizations will automatically strive towards using those systems in their daily work. So this raises a whole lot of questions about how do they use them, what about data security, all these things that come with that. So what do you think an organization needs to do today, right now, in order to not let that drift into a non-desired direction? So if you, what would you say is the homework of any organization with a decent, like with a certain size, that has all these kind of different business areas like production, design, sales, commercial? What would you say as an organizational function, oversight function? What is it that we need to do right now?
Yeah, it's such a big question. Look, what's coming to my mind is actually, I think traditionally, we've been aware for a while that, there's hard skills and soft skills. And traditionally, probably we have valued the hard skills. And I think actually the hard skills is where, automation and AI augmentation can really, really play a role very, very quickly. And I think that's where the danger lies. So to me, I think the homework is really to start to value the human soft skills, because that's where the longer term value is for society. And we have to, and that has to be an honest, assessment of what are the real important skills for our organization for the future, in terms of how we contribute to society, not to the bottom line per se, right? So without that sort of honest assessment, I think all those competitive pressures that we were talking about will drive too much towards just, codifying as much as possible the hard stuff. And that will generate a very quick, financial return or impact.
Yeah.
And without continuing in our way to kind of discount the softer things because they're harder to measure, they're harder to quantify, they're harder to codify. I think that's where the trap will be, so.
Yeah, I think, one of the things we've been working on at BlueQuist for quite some time now is exactly this question: how do you combine human-centered skill development with intelligent data systems?
Yeah.
And I mean, I think social ethical imperative frameworks or guiding frameworks are very important because they steer the whole implementation roadmap, how you utilize. And
I really like. Yeah, I really like the direction that you're starting to go with the holistic skills assessment or the dynamic skills assessment, because it's starting to try and interrogate, the human aspect of a person, right? Not just the superficial layer of the skill, but what's behind the skill. The motivational value.
Exactly.
Aspects, the commitment levels that you may have. I think that's really an interesting direction to start to take it, because that's where, this more human-sided approach is.
Exactly.
What do we really need to understand? Do we really need to understand that you can perform these activities by using, knowledge and hard skills, or that, that we understand better your values, your motivations, your intentions?
Yes.
Because that's where,
that's where the actual complexity of human nature lies, right? Because we are not just functioning robots that work by technical or functional skills. You cannot expect full performance by someone that has the skills to do the job, but not the motivation to do the job, or not the aspiration to grow in that field. And that's why what we are working on is, like, you also, together with you, is the systems we're building to aim to make organizations more aware of the real capabilities of the people. And that's where artificial intelligence can come in to support that process and make it more visible and tangible. And I love your notion of dynamic skill ontologies and topologies that naturally evolve with the organization and grow with the organization, where you reduce the actual work to building them, but you use them to fuel the actual growth of the organization and people by giving individual support to each member of with dynamic learning content, recommendations for career development, maybe also alternating career choices as recommendations coming out of that system. But you still need to combine the actual, you need to really interact with employees. What do they need and want, and not let that an AI system like ideate or interference reference out of some CV or something, but also use then a system that's our approach to intelligently, logically bring that information together and make it visible, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, we're on a journey, really. I think we started with very superficial understanding of ourselves and the sorts of capabilities we need, and we focused on very high level, surface level understandings of, how long have you been in this industry?
Yes.
How long were you, that experience level sort of understanding, which didn't really tell us much. So that led us to go a little bit deeper. And skills are more important. I don't need to know whether you've had 5 years experience, but what I really need to know is whether you can perform this particular activity reliably and effectively, repeatedly.
Yes, true.
Now, already we're starting to go deeper again. Why do you want to perform this activity?
Yes, why and for what
do
end?
you want to learn new activities? That's deeper. And
And how do those activities benefit your growth in the future, right? So
absolutely, yeah.
your ability to also finance your life and stay, how do they stay relevant? So I don't like that term, but stay relevant in the marketplace, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, maybe because we're nearing the end of the podcast, maybe 1 or 2 more questions or themes. What new capabilities will leaders need in this organization? What capabilities top 3 capabilities should leaders develop to make a positive impact in the future in an organization with that kind of theme?
Yeah, so look, I think generally, leaders or not, the ability to learn is key. We see it now very obviously. Things change so much. You just need to be able to learn quickly. You need to be able to, whether you call it learning or whether you call it resilience or agility, maybe you could have a good debate on that. But I think of it in terms of learning. I think you need to have the ability to self-reflect and be self-aware, and then identify ways to, respond to that information, to learn how to improve, to learn how to develop, to learn how to adapt.
Yeah.
I really like this phrase that living systems are learning systems, and once they stop learning, they die. So learning is key. I think that what we've been talking about a lot is, the ability to collaborate becomes more and more important. We always knew it is important because, that's how we get things done, by working together. But it's more and more important and more complex now. So I think just the ability of, in a way, it is a leadership skill or a management skill that we need to get even better at, is just how you make people work together and how you make AI and people work together. That's kind of critical. I think in the human to human interactions, skills like coaching, being able to have dialogue, listening, very human focused skills, conflict resolution, they're more and more important, more and more valuable.
Yes.
And then, as I say, this sort of critical reasoning, the ability to step back and understand, what are we trying to achieve? What are my underlying intentions? What are the processes involved to create those sorts of outcomes? How can I challenge my assumptions and my beliefs? How can I check and review? That sort of critical, what I would term critical reasoning, I think that's crucial.
Which is interesting, because all of these things you just mentioned are not hard functional skills. No. They are all on the social collaborative reasoning side. So the actual social cognitive abilities that we have as humans. So they seemingly become center spot. And when machines start to do more and more of the actual functional work. Right? So okay. Maybe one closing question. statement from you. If organizations get this balance right, so the AI acceleration combined with human sense-making and ratification, what do you think becomes possible that wasn't possible before, and how will this benefit organizations? Maybe from the top of your head, what's one thing that makes this a better future for us?
I don't know if I can predict the future, or well, I know I can't predict the future, so I'm not sure I can directly answer your question. But what I've been thinking about as we've been discussing is really, our predominant mindset has been a machine-based mindset, right? And I think that's allowed us to do a lot of amazing things, to the point now where we're able to design machines that can think for themselves, right? So we kind of reached the limit of that paradigm. I think that a better future lies if we can reshape the paradigm to be more of a human, not a machine way of looking at the world, without losing the benefits of the machine paradigm and the capabilities you get with this sort of mechanistic world that we live in. But I think the human, if we can design a world that's based on the human paradigm, which is much more complex, much more about relationships and connections, the possibilities are infinite compared to what we can conceive today.
So the paradox is here also strong. AI pushes us towards more valuing and building our social human traits and coherence patterns, by therefore not losing that kind of ability. But in turn, if we get this right, we can, through using those automated systems, increase well-being, productivity, and all those things that really bring us into air. So I think that's, Andrew, I think that's a good closing note. Also, because I'm running out of time, unfortunately. But we
can talk about this forever, I reckon.
Yeah, we could. But I think that's a good closing note, and I think something also to reflect on for our listeners and for ourselves. And I'm sure we will talk about that in our personal conversations in the next weeks to come, intensively. But now we're at 47 minutes. I think it was a really cool conversation and a good flow. Thank you so much for your time. And I hope to meet you back on the podcast again sometime in the future. And with that, thank you so much, Andrew, and talk soon, right?
Definitely. Thanks very much, Johannes. I enjoyed it. Speak to you later.
Bye-bye.